Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Just a little note, I have a subscription service available for this podcast series. You're able to get the episodes released to you a week prior, and you also get access to bonus episodes. There are currently 16 bonus episodes to listen to, so for as little as a coffee a month, you'll be able to access the extension to stories, particularly the bushranger stories, where it talks about their family members that continue living on in Australia and getting an insight as to how they would have felt at the time that their brother or uncle or nephew was on the run. And there's also attachments to stories based on where they lived, such as the Wise family, but there's also bonus episodes attached to Alphaeus Barrington's son, Jack Barrington, who was a mystery to me largely, and I uncovered some really interesting information about him. He was a professional whistler who travelled around South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales. I've also got Ray Blair's extra to her episodes on Theo's duty. And I've also got some follow-up episodes related to the Deniliquin bank robbery. So I would appreciate it if you would consider assisting me in my research in the time that it takes and sign up to subscribe. I also have a Facebook page, so when you're listening to the stories, tune into the Facebook page, Family History Mysteries, as I add photos that relate to the person so you can put a face to the name as you're listening to the podcast. Episode 102, Edward De Lacy Evans. Edward De Lacy Evans, in 1879, was discovered to be a woman, but he'd lived, dressed, worked and loved for many years as a man. Edward De Lacy Evans made international news when he was revealed that he was born Ellen Tremaye. Edward lived for at least 22 years as a man. Ellen Tremaye was born in 1830 in Kilkenny, Ireland. There were reports that Ellen had borne an illegitimate child in Ireland and fled to America, and then she was supposed to have returned to Ireland but was forced by social disapproval of her immoral life to sail to Australia on the Ocean Monarch. Ellen immigrated to Australia on the 23rd of June 1856, using her birth name, in the Victorian boom gold rush period. She embarked from Plymouth, England, and listed herself as single, Roman Catholic and a domestic servant. Upon boarding the ship, she wore a green merino dress and a sealskin coat, as was expected for her assigned gender. Beneath it, though, lay traditionally masculine clothing, a men's shirt and trousers. She was said to have worn two different outfits, one over the other, every day she was aboard the ship. She was said to have a travelling trunk full of male attire, and her travelling trunk was stamped with the name Edward De Lacy Evans. This and the fact he appeared to have formed sexual attachments with some of the women he shared a cabin with led to onboard speculation that he was a man impersonating a woman. One of these women were later identified as Rose Kelly, who was said to have been taken ill and as a result departed Rio de Janeiro en route, while the other was said to have been a Mary Montague. As a condition of her assisted passage under the name Ellen Tremaye, had been indentured as a maidservant to McKetty, a Melton hotel keeper, at a wage of 25 shillings per week. But she soon left the position when it was found that she spent the night in the wife's bed and she was horsewhipped by the enraged husband. She found one of her fellow passengers from the Ocean Monarch, Mary Delahunty. Delahunty was a 34-year-old governess from Harristown, Waterford, in a similar area of Ireland to Evans, and another of the close attachments that she made on the voyage. Mrs. Thompson, a passenger on the Ocean Monarch, later said that Delahunty was in possession of £900. Mrs. Thompson also recalls Evans saying that she would marry Delahunty as soon as the ship reached Melbourne. So after leaving service in Melton, Ellen Tremaye morphed into Edward De Lacy Evans. So from now on, I'm going to refer to Ellen as a he. With Evans wearing male clothes and calling himself Edmund De Lacy, they married under Roman Catholic faith at St Francis Church in 1856. Little is known of Evans and Delahunty's married life over the next few years, but there were reports that they did not live comfortably together. Evans worked as a miner at Blackwood in the state's northwest, not far from Melton, where he'd been employed as Ellen Tremaye, and Mary followed him in 1858. He told miners who he worked with that he had been born in France, had stolen £500 as a boy and fled to Waterford, where he acquired his Irish accent. A woman living near Corrop, near Rushworth in Victoria, claimed to be a former Kilkenny neighbour and said that Edward was the well-born Ellen Lacy who had an illegitimate child, fled to America and returned in the 1850s as Mrs. De Lacy Evans to ride her horse through a gathering called by John Ponsonby, 5th Earl of Bessborough, before being dragged off her pony and forced to clear out. Evans's third wife said the name was a family one and his uncle was the British General George De Lacy Evans, a prominent military man at the Crimean War and part of the Irish establishment. Mary Delahunty established a school in Blackwood. In 1862 she left Edward to marry Lyman Oatman Hart, an American mining surveyor. Mary told all who objected to this blatant act of bigamy that her first marriage was not legal, as Evans was a woman. Delahunty and Hart moved to Daylesford, where they lived through the 1860s and 1870s. Lyman Hart became Mayor of Daylesford in 1878. They had one child, a son, Lyman Delahunty Hart Jr., who was born in 1863, and Lyman's descendants live in Melbourne. Evans also left Blackwood in 1862, moving to the central Victorian city of Sandhurst, now known as Bendigo, and describing himself as a widower. He married a 23-year-old Irish woman, Sarah Moore. Over the next 5 years, he held various occupations, including a carter, miner, blacksmith and ploughman, and lived with Moore in several nearby towns. He also owned shares in a number of gold mines and paid property rates in Sandhurst and the adjoining district of Eaglehawk. When he was found in a servant's bedroom at a local hotel, he was jailed for trespass for 7 days. Him and Sarah had worked at the local hotel and they got away with swindling a fellow miner out of £175. There was evidence that Sarah Moore, after about a year of marriage, became aware of the masquerade and was not happy with the situation. A witness even reported that Moore punched Evans in the breast in her weak place. In 1867, Moore died of pulmonary tuberculosis, and the following year Evans met and married a friend of his former wife's sister, 25-year-old Julia Marquand. Marquand was a French dressmaker's assistant who lived with her sister and brother-in-law, the prominent Sandhurst businessman and owner of the City Family Hotel, Jean-Baptiste Loredan, who had preyed upon Julia from a young age. In the early years of their marriage, Evans and Marquand lived apart, but the couple reconciled by 1872. Evans progressed in his mining profession, and their Sandhurst home was a cottage that he had built. In 1877, Marquand gave birth to a daughter, the couple called Julia Mary. Edward gave his name as the father on the birth certificate. Loredan was the chairman of the board of Bendigo Hospital and a major shareholder in the mine where Evans worked. And according to Evans' wife Julia, the biological father of Evans and Marquard's daughter. Around this period, Evans was injured at work and became ill, and while he welcomed the child as his own, he was also deeply disturbed by the circumstances in which his wife became pregnant. These disturbances were why on the 21st of July 1879, Loredan took him to the Bendigo Hospital and said he was dangerous to others. But when told to take a bath, Evans refused and escaped. The following day he was arrested at home and brought to the police court, where the magistrates agreed with the medical assessment that Evans was suffering from softening of the brain and ordered him to be involuntarily committed to the lunatic ward of the Bendigo Hospital. It was claimed that Evans became violent to Julia and their 15-month-old daughter, fell into a deep depression and was admitted suffering from amentia, in other words, a severe mental illness. On the 23rd of July 1879, the Bendigo Advertiser reports, lunacy. A man named Edward De Lacy Evans was brought before Samuels and Holdsworth at the police court yesterday. He had been arrested by the police at Quarry Hill and was suffering from softening of the brain. On the certificate of Doctors Crookshank and J. Boyd, he was ordered to be sent to the lunatic ward of the Bendigo Hospital. For 6 weeks at the Bendigo Hospital, Evans refused to take a bath. He shared a room with a warder called Gundry, to whom he said that his parents were Irish, but that he had come from France when he was 7 or 8 years of age. However, when Gundry used some French phrases, Evans claimed that he had forgotten the language. While there, he did have regular visits from his wife and daughter, as well as other relatives, one of whom called Evans uncle, while Julia Mary called him dads. While still a patient at Bendigo, Evans said he knew who the father of the child was, made a reference to his wife as not being true, and mentioned concerns about financial difficulties and the possibility of losing the house that he had built, before adding, everything coming together was enough to drive a man mad. Marquand also spoke to the press, and she insisted that she'd never known Evans was not a man. She ingeniously accounted for the child by saying that she believed that some strange man entered the house one night about the time her husband should have returned home. She also stated that Evans would never let her see him stripped or washing himself, and when Evans suffered a head injury in the mining accident, that Evans would not let the doctor examine him further. On the 30th of August 1879, the hospital decided to send Evans and another patient to the Kew Asylum near Melbourne, accompanied by a police constable. Marquand was at the station, and Evans told her to take care of Julia Mary, and both he and his wife were weeping by the time they left. The events at Kew Asylum were described in the Argus on the 3rd of September 1879, and it stated a curious incident occurred at Kew Lunatic Asylum. A lunatic was brought from Sandhurst by the police and was admitted into one of the male wards. The patient was tolerably quiet until preparations were made for giving him the usual bath. On the attendants attempting to carry out the program, violent resistance was made, the reason for which proved to be that the supposed man was in reality a woman. The most singular part of the affair is that the woman had been received into Sandhurst Hospital as a male patient and sent thence to the asylum under the name of Evans. She states that she's lived at Sandhurst for many years, dressed in male attire, and she's about 35. There were photographs taken of Evans at this time, and Evans does not look particularly masculine, only 160 centimetres in height, a light voice and no beard. It was reported that fellow miners referred to him as the old woman, so it is possible that there was an unspoken knowledge of his true gender. There is only one main interview that quotes him directly, even laughing, and from this we can get an idea of him speaking in a light brogue, but always secretive. Here he describes his journey and arrival at Kew. I was sitting in the carriage at the railway station, and the wife was crying and the kid was squealing, and I was laughing at him. Well, when we got to Kew, the fellas there took hold of me to give me a bath, and they stripped me to put me in water, and then they saw the mistake. One fella ran off as if frightened. The others looked thunderstruck and couldn't speak. I was handed over to the women, and they dressed me up in frocks and petticoats. Uncomfortable in female dress in the asylum, Evans attacked a male visitor, trying unsuccessfully to steal his clothes. The voyeuristic attitude of the press and its readers is particularly interesting at this time. On the 4th of September 1879, the Bendigo Advertiser boasted of a clamour from readers for 1,000 extra copies of the issue devoted to the De Lacy Evans case, and they published a special supplement which was called The Extraordinary Case of Concealment of Sex, and wrote, one of the most unparalleled impostors has been brought to light during the last few days, which it has ever been the province of the press of these colonies to chronicle, and we might even add is unprecedented in the annals of the whole world. A woman under the name of Edward De Lacy Evans has for 20 years passed for a man in various parts of the colony of Victoria. It was soon reported by local newspapers and the colonial and international press that Evans had been determined by the Kew Asylum to be a woman, and promptly handed over to female nurses and sent back to Bendigo. Another intrusion was a gynecological examination conducted by Dr. Penfold, which caused Evans to cry and scream when the speculum was used, and resulted in finding that he was physiologically female and had carried and borne a child. Evans later said the examination had injured him. He attempted and then abandoned a hunger strike at this time. Bendigo photographer Nicholas White somehow obtained access to Evans just after he had been readmitted to the Bendigo lunacy ward and took a trick photograph of her dressed in both male and female clothing. White also took a series of head and shoulder portraits of Evans wearing what seems to be a white hospital nightshirt or straitjacket. White's action seems to be a clear case of exploitation. In the photographs, Evans stares out at us, wild-eyed and probably affronted by the intrusion. So in the Bendigo Advertiser on the 4th of September 1879, as mentioned, there was a supplement called The Extraordinary Case of Concealment of Sex. I'm going to read that in a little more detail. A woman under the name of Edward De Lacy Evans has for 20 years passed for a man in various parts of the colony of Victoria and was resident in Sandhurst during the greater part of that time. It is absolutely certain that the imposter has been twice married, and a third, although not circumstantially authenticated, is highly probable. The circumstances which have led to the discovery of the imposture are that on the 22nd of July last, a man named Edward De Lacy Evans was brought before Samuels and Holdsworth at the police court. He'd been arrested by the police at Quarry Hills, suffering from softening of the brain. On the certificate of Cruikshank and Boyd, he was ordered to be sent to the lunatic ward of the Bendigo Hospital. Accordingly, he was conveyed to the Bendigo Hospital, where, as in all similar institutions, it's customary to give all patients a thorough wash before placing them in the wards. On attempting to strip Evans, he resisted and regained possession of his clothing and left the hospital and returned to his home. His friends conveyed him back on the following day, when he was stated to the attendants that he'd had a bath while away. He was then placed in the lunatic ward under the charge of the warden named Gundry, who slept in the same room with him for 6 weeks without ever suspecting the sex of his patient. As Evans was perfectly sound in body, Dr. Poland, the resident surgeon of the hospital, did not examine him except to his mental state, and no one about the institution had the slightest suspicion that the patient was a female, more especially as his wife with a baby in arms visited him every Sunday. On Saturday the 30th, Bain and Strickland, official visitors, inspected the lunacy wards of the hospital and, after conferring with Dr. Poland, ordered the removal of 2 insane patients, one of whom was De Lacy Evans, to the Kew Lunatic Asylum. Evans was conveyed to Melbourne in the custody of a constable and seen off at the railway station by his wife. He was greatly affected and charged his wife to be very careful of the child, and as the train left the station, both his wife and he were weeping. Nothing was known of the extraordinary discovery which has been made until the Melbourne papers arrived in Sandhurst at 11 o'clock yesterday. On visiting the hospital to make inquiries, a representative was afforded an interview with the patient. Evans was lying in bed with a pile of women's clothing on a chair at the foot, similar to those worn by female inmates at the Kew Lunatic Asylum. At the side of the bed were a pair of long Wellington boots, which the patient had worn with male attire. Evans is about 40 years of age and has all the appearance of a man in the face, except that he is quite beardless. He stands 5 feet 4 inches high, has a slight but wiry build, with strong muscular arms and hands which show evident signs of arduous toil in which he has been engaged for the past 20 years. He is possessed of rather handsome features, clearly cut, but seamed with the marks of anxiety. Fair complexion, aquiline nose, grey, piercing eyes, hair originally brown and curly but now thickly streaked with grey and worn rather long for a man. The forehead is very low and is the only sign of the incipient insanity which must have been lying dormant from his earliest youth, and may in some manner account for the insane, not to say criminal, imposition of which he's been found guilty. Evans replied in a wild and incoherent style, and little of any importance could be gleaned from him. He admitted that he'd been working in the mines for 20 years, but would not say in what particular one or the name of any of his mates. He asked if the old woman, meaning his wife, knew of it, and whether his brother-in-law had been told of it. To every question he gives an evasive reply. When asked by whom he was married, he replied, an hotel keeper, from which reply it will be seen that the wretched creature's wits are far from being in their right place. Towards the close of the interview, Evans became quite excited and totally unintelligible in his talk, and as there is nothing further to be gained from our reporter, he left to seek for further information elsewhere. Dr. Poland said, "The lunatic patients are treated differently to other inmates of the institution. The bath is not compulsory, but the attendant had told him that Evans had been in the bath. As the patient was not suffering from any bodily illness, the doctor did not think it necessary to examine him except to the state of his mind, and therefore did not hold the slightest suspicion of the impostor's sex. Dr. Poland, on Evans' return from Kew Asylum, of course, made an examination of the patient and had found that Evans had actually borne one or more children. The breasts were scarcely distinguishable from those of a man, which is accounted for by the hard work Evans had been at. But during the time the patient had been in hospital, the sedentary life and quiet had made perceptible difference in the appearance. The warrant on which Evans was committed to the lunatic ward of the hospital described him as a male, aged 37, married, native of County Kilkenny, Ireland, Church of England, and that he was suffering from dementia and was dangerous to others. So that, with the additional fact that the supposed man's wife and child visited him every Sunday, Dr. Poland may be excused for not examining the patient more closely. The matron of the Bendigo Hospital, Mrs. Holt, who paid a visit to Evans in the lunatic ward yesterday after a number of other persons had identified the patient as the same person who had been working in various mines of the district, Mrs. Holt was struck with the resemblance Evans bore to a female passenger who arrived in the same ship with the matron, whose story we give for what it's worth. Mrs. Holt states about 20 years ago she came to the colony in the ship Ocean Monarch, and on the voyage she became acquainted with a girl named Ellen Tremaye who had 2 trunks with her, one labelled Ellen Tremaye and the other marked Not Wanted on the Voyage, that was labelled Edward De Lacy Evans. After the ship arrived in Melbourne, the girl Tremaye went up to the country, taking with her the box labelled with her own name and subsequently sent for the box labelled De Lacy Evans. The next thing that Mrs. Holt heard of her was that she returned to Melbourne in men's clothing and married a fellow passenger, but Mrs. Holt did not give any credence to this report. Mrs. Holt is, however, positive that Evans is identical with the woman Ellen Tremaye. The next that is known of Evans is that he turned up at Eaglehawk and was working in the mines there for some years. About 1865 or 1866, he married a young girl named Sarah Moore, who died at a house in Victoria Street, Eaglehawk, in giving birth to a child. The certificate of this woman's death we have seen. It bears the date of the 31st of August 1867 and states that Sarah De Lacy Evans was buried at Eaglehawk Cemetery on that date. Previous to this, it stated that Evans's first wife had 2 children, both of which died, but it is shrewdly supposed that they were the offspring of the impostor and that it was to hide his or her shame that he adopted male attire, but this does not explain his object in marrying 2 women subsequently. It seems perfectly astonishing that such an imposition could have successfully been carried on in a civilised community for such a length of time, and that the girl Sarah Moore could have died without the impostor being brought to light. Evans, while at Eaglehawk, was known to Mr. John J. Hall, who with his wife frequently visited the family. Mr. Hall states that he has known Evans for upwards of 15 years, during which time he had opportunities of observing Evans at work in the mines, and to his certain knowledge, the girl Sarah Moore died at Eaglehawk about the date stated. Mr. Hall had never had any suspicions of Evans and was as much astonished as anyone at the extraordinary discovery which has been made. The girl Sarah Moore had a sister who worked at a large drapery establishment now known as Buick Henderson & Co. in Pall Mall. This sister introduced Evans to Julia Marquand, and the pair began enamoured and were married in Ballarat. The certificate of the marriage we have also seen and bears the date of the 18th of September 1868. The ceremony was performed at the Presbyterian Church. In the certificate, Evans's age is stated at 28. He's described as a minor, a widower, birthplace Paris, and the document witnessed by Alan McCormick and Duncan Urquhart. The document also sets forth that the father of the bridegroom was Edward John De Lacy Evans, police magistrate, but it does not state of what place, and the mother, Anne Dora Van Welsh. Julia Marquand is the sister of the wife of a well-known speculator, largely interested in milling in this city. After the marriage at Ballarat, Evans and his wife lived in separate houses for about a fortnight, when they rented a small house where they lived together for some months, after which Evans went to Pleasant Creek and worked in the mines there. For 5 or 6 years, their friends lost sight of them, and they next turned up at Sandhurst about the time of the excitement in mining of 1871. Evans, through the influence of his brother-in-law, obtained employment as a miner at the New Chum Extended Company, where he worked for some time. After this, he was employed in the Cosmopolitan and Sea Companies, and latterly in the Great Southern Company. The miners of the latter company say that Evans was capable of doing an 8-hour shift as the best man in the claim until about 18 months ago, when his wife gave birth to a child, which was named Julia Mary. After this event, Evans seemed to be absent-minded and would only work for half an hour at a time and then sit down and ruminate. On being asked the reason why he did not go on with his work, he could give no satisfactory replies, and the miners considered it very strange and used to call him the old woman. For the last 4 or 5 years, Evans and his wife have been living at Quarry Hill. Constable Bradley, who is stationed in that locality, has known them for 4 years past and has always heard Evans spoken of as an able miner and never heard the slightest suspicion expressed of his sex. About the time of his wife's confinement, Constable Bradley served Evans with a summons for rates and afterwards put in an execution in the house at the instance of the landlord, but owing to the sickness of the wife, the execution was withdrawn. Constable Bradley saw Evans at the hospital yesterday and recognised him. He held his hand out to Evans and said, "How are you?" And Evans replied, "Well, Bradley, old man, I'm first rate, thank you." The strange part of the affair is that Dr. James Boyd had been the medical attendant of the family for many years and has attended Evans for more than one illness. Once for a scalp wound received through a mining accident and again for a fever. Dr. Boyd attended his wife in her confinement and vaccinated the child in August 1878 when it was 5 months old, and yet never had the slightest suspicion that Evans was other than a man. Evans for many years has laid claim to be the nephew of the late General Sir Charles De Lacy Evans of Crimean fame, and his wife states that she posted some letters to that address some years back. What steps will be taken in the case by the police we have not been able to ascertain, but no doubt it will be fully investigated, as it cannot be allowed to remain at its present stage. To prevent confusion, we have been speaking of Evans always adhering to the use of a masculine pronoun. The woman is definitely insane and has been for so many years, as he acts testified, as no one but a mad woman would have been guilty of such aggregations fully and criminally without any apparent object. Sooner or later, the imposture must have been found out, and the only wonder is that it has been kept secret all these years. The exposé which must necessarily result will be exceedingly painful for the friends of the parties, but it is now unavoidable. And on this same date, 4th of September 1879, in the Bendigo Advertiser, the article is titled "Interview with Mrs. Evans." As many contradictory versions were circulated in reference to Mrs. Evans and the circumstances of her supposed married life, we were unable to discriminate between the right and the wrong in order to place an authentic statement before the public. One of our reporters waited upon her last evening and gleaned the following particulars. Her maiden name was Julia Marquand, and between 12 and 13 years ago she was employed at Francis Brothers Drapers of Pall Mall, and there she became acquainted with a Miss Moore, sister to Evans' former wife, and through her she became acquainted with Evans. On the death of his first wife, which took place at Eagle Hawk in August 1867, he kept company with her for about 12 months and then proposed marriage. She accepted him and everything was arranged for the wedding, and at his request she went to Ballarat to be married, as he said her sister-in-law had an objection to them being married. On the 18th of September 1868, she being 25 years of age, she was married to him at the Presbyterian Church, Ballarat. After the wedding, he took her to a hotel and provided her with apartments, whilst he stayed at Sweeney's Slaughter Yards, where he obtained work. A fortnight after, he took 2 rooms in a private home, and they lived together for another fortnight as man and wife. He then went to Stawell and was engaged there in driving a horse and dray, and in order to maintain herself, Mrs. Evans accepted a situation as a machinist in a draper's shop in Bridge Street, and this she kept for 18 months. One evening, on returning to her lodgings, she was insulted by a man in Bridge Street, and she wrote to Evans begging him to come to her. He accordingly came down from Stawell, but did not offer to take her back with him, and after staying a few days, returned to Stawell. Shortly after this she followed him, but he did not offer to provide for her and wanted her to go back to her place at Ballarat. This she resolutely refused to do, and he then took a house and they lived about 2 years in Stawell, when he left and went to Sandhurst. She remained about 3 months. After maintaining herself for sewing for Mr. Allingham, the draper, When, being very miserable, she wrote to her friends at Sandhurst and gave up her situation and came to them, concluding that he did not pay her any attention. He only married for her to keep him, which she would not do. At this time, he had obtained work as a miner and they went to live together at View Grove Cottage, Quarry Hill. Soon afterwards, as he was away at night for the sake of company, they removed to Mrs. Loft's, her sister's house at Denmark Cottage, Hargrave Street, where they lived for 2 years. On Mr. and Mrs. Loft's leaving for England, Evans built the house that she now resides in, Jersey Cottage off Russell Street, Quarry Hill, where they lived for 4 years. During the whole of this time, he followed the occupation of a miner and was working at the Great Southern Company and Sea Company, and between 4 and 5 years ago, he met with an accident at the latter company's mine, owing to a fall of earth. The first indications she noticed of him not being right in his head were in February last, when he became very strange in his behaviour. This was after he had been laid up for 2 months with fever, and she attributed it to that. He continued to be strange in his ways, was very exacting in his requirements, and if everything was not ready for him and done to his liking, he would blow up fearful. And she was told by Dr. Boyd that he was not safe to be left alone, and he complained greatly of his head. At this time, he was working at the Great Southern Company, and 7 weeks ago on Friday, on going to work, as there seemed to be something wrong with him, the manager told him to go home. He did so and was removed to the Bendigo hospital, and she visited him 3 times a week. He always cried very bitterly when he saw her there, and seemed to have a heavy load on his mind, as he continued to mutter that if he got one of that, he would make it hot for somebody. During the whole 8 years that she lived in the same house with him, she considered him a strange man. He would never strip in her presence and had a great objection to her being in the room when he was washing. The strangest part of this very strange story is that Mrs. Evans has a little girl, 18 months old, and which Evans says is his. The only way Mrs. Evans can account for the child is that she believes some strange man entered the house one night about the time her husband should have returned home when working his afternoon shift. He also told her that he had 2 children by his first wife, but they were in Ireland. The poor woman is in a sad way and is left entirely unprovided for, and the house she lives in is mortgaged to the Building Society. And in the Bendigo Advertiser on the 5th of September 1879, further particulars. The strange and almost incredible story published in our issue yesterday of a woman for over 20 years has passed for a man, during which time the impostor married 3 women, each of whom bore children, was the sole topic of conversation in the city yesterday. As the case was still shrouded in mystery and the identity of the woman who has carried on this gigantic fraud for a whole lifetime was only problematical, we have instigated further inquiries, which have brought to light some other facts of this case. The police as yet have not taken any steps to a view to clearing up the mystery, and it has been left to private enterprise to set at rest the doubts which yet remain as to the identity of the woman who has been going under the name of Edward De Lacy Evans. Amongst the passengers on the ship the Ocean Monarch, Ellen Tremaye was considered to be well connected in Ireland, and it was generally understood that her father was a police magistrate in Dublin. As she was a strange-tempered girl, her shipmates took more notice of her than they would have otherwise done, and the theory amongst them as to the cause of Ellen Tremaye's leaving Ireland for Australia was that she ran away, avoiding the consequences of a family scandal. It was customary on board an emigrant ship for the females to sleep in pairs in the same bunk. Ellen Tremaye's first bedfellow died at Rio de Janeiro, a port in South America, where the ship called for stores and water, as the voyage was a very lengthy one. Her second bedfellow was a quiet girl named Mary Montague, and some days after the ship landed her passengers in Melbourne, Evans came down from the country dressed in men's clothes and married Mary Montague. Amongst those who visited Evans yesterday were Mr. and Mrs. B. Mrs. B, in the year 1856, built a hotel at Myers Flat, where she carried on business for some years. She stated that towards the latter part of 1859, she was one day coming into Bendigo in a cab when she met Evans, whom she knew as having been recently married to Sarah Moore, his second wife. He was very stylishly dressed and wore an overcoat, which was a peculiar circumstance in those early days. Mrs. B since that has known Evans up to the present time and states that the facts narrated in our last issue are correct to her certain knowledge. Mrs. Holt, the nurse that had come out on the same ship as Evans, had a conversation with Evans, and Mrs. B was present. And Mrs. Holt said to Evans, "Well, Nellie, how are you?" Evans turned sharply round and said, "What did you call me that for?" Mrs. Thompson, who has a dairy farm at Myers Creek, 4 miles from Eaglehawk, was a fellow passenger of the girl Ellen Tremaye on the ship Ocean Monarch 14 years back. Mrs. Thompson had recognised Evans in Eaglehawk while he was married to Sarah Moore, his second wife. After considerable trouble, Mrs. Thompson's farm was found hidden away in the scrub north of Eaglehawk. She proved to be most communicative and gave the information required of her in so circumstantial a manner that her evidence clearly fixes the identity of Evans with the girl Ellen Tremaye. Mrs. Thompson states that she is a native of a little village called Monachine in the parish of Iver, county of Kilkenny. Mrs. Thompson, whose maiden name was Margaret Summers, left the village in company with an orphan named Mary Ann Delahunty, who she states was possessed of a sum of £900. She knew the family of the girl Delahunty and states that the latter was very religious, being intended for a nun, but through some freak decided to immigrate to Australia. The two girls arrived in Dublin together and embarked on the Ocean Monarch. Ellen Tremaye joined the ship at Dublin. Mrs. Thompson said from the first moment Ellen Tremaye came on board the ship, she was peculiar in all she did. She used to wear men's drawers and shirts, over which she wore petticoats and a woman's dress. Strange rumours were afloat amongst the passengers of the ship regarding her, and it was currently reported that she was a man in disguise. For the first part of the voyage, which was a very long one lasting over 9 months, Ellen Tremaye slept in the same bunk with a girl named Rose Kelly, who was taken seriously ill when the ship had travelled about halfway. For the remainder of the voyage, Ellen Tremaye and Mary Ann Delahunty became good friends and used to sleep in the same bunk together, and Mrs. Thompson remembers hearing Ellen Tremaye say that when she arrived in Melbourne, she would marry Mary Ann Delahunty. It is evident from this that the woman must have been mad upon the subject of sex from the time she left Ireland. Mrs. Thompson, after she left the ship, was almost immediately drafted from the immigration depot to a situation up country. The next she knows of this strange case is that some years after, she was serving milk to a Mrs. Forrest at Peglog Gully, and this Mrs. Forrest recommended a neighbour as a fresh customer. Mrs. Thompson went to the house to which she was directed, and the person who opened the door to her was identical to Ellen Tremaye. The woman was dressed in men's clothes of a very stylish cut, was married, and was then going under the name of Edward De Lacy Evans. The following conversation ensued. Evans said, "I know you." Mrs. T said, "And I know you." Evans said, "What ship did you come out in?" And Mrs. T said, "The Ocean Monarch. Don't you remember?" Evans said, "Yes." Mrs. T asked, "Where is Miss Delahunty?" And Evans said, "Oh, my dear lady wife and boy died of consumption and were buried in Melbourne." Mrs. T said, "Where did her money go to?" And Evans said, "She sent it home to the nunnery." Mrs. T said, "Is that true?" And Evans said, "Yes, quite true." During this conversation, Evans' wife was at the rear of the building cleansing a vessel to receive the milk in. Evans then came outside the door and caught hold of Mrs. Thompson, saying in an imploring manner, "For your life, don't mention my name. Call me Mr. De Lacy Evans." When Mrs. Thompson asked what he meant by that, Evans replied, "My missus is from the north of Ireland and is Roman Catholic, and if she hears you call me Tremaye, she'll be very angry." From the date of this conversation till she heard of the strange disclosures which have been made during the last day or two, Mrs. Thompson is positive that Evans and Ellen Tremaye are identical. Mrs. Thompson seems to have been labouring under the idea that the rumours about Ellen Tremaye being a man were true, and therefore did not take any steps to expose Evans. Mrs. Thompson has not identified Evans yet personally, but will do so if required. From the foregoing, it will be seen that the chain of evidence is nearly complete, and it only requires the police authorities to take a little trouble in the matter to have it thoroughly cleared up. By an examination of the register of the North Melbourne Cemetery, the fact of the first marriage and death of the wife can be verified. On Evans's own admission, he did come to the country on the Ocean Monarch, and the train of events is complete from that to the present date. It's said that Tremaye made a statement that she was the daughter of a respectable family in Ireland, and while in the position of a nursery governess, she was seduced by a nephew of General De Lacy Evans. Her lover promised to take her with him to Australia and sent on board the ship a chest containing his clothes. She believes that he never intended to accompany her and states that when she found herself deserted and alone, the notion of merging her identity into that of a man who had betrayed her occurred to her mind, and a combination of fortunate accidents enabled her to carry out her purpose. And unless some sort of evidence is obtained from England, the case will remain as one of the most strange and mysterious in the history of imposter. Another theory given by the press was that she could have stole the trunk of clothing, which evidently contained money and valuables, also, and assumed the name and attire of a man to hide her identity. We certainly think that the police should sift this strange affair to the bottom, and goodness knows what crimes may have been perpetrated to enable the fraud to be carried out to the length that it has been. The two first wives and an indefinite number of children have disappeared most strangely, and although the affair is sensational enough in all conscience, there are many things in connection with it which have not been yet brought to light. We should state that when Evans was taken to Bendigo Hospital the first time on the 21st of July, it was on a subscriber's ticket for bodily illness, and the authorities had no power to detain her, but Dr. Poland immediately gave information to the police and had her committed as a lunatic on the following day. Mr. Aaron Flegenthal, who is at present engaging in taking a view of this city for the Sydney exhibition, has shown us two photographs of Evans and wife taken at stall 8 years ago. One is a bust photograph of Evans in male attire, and from it no one would ever suspect that it was the likeness of a woman. The other is a full-length photo of Evans and his wife, both with excellent likenesses. It was reported in the Bendigo Advertiser on the 11th of September 1879, the De Lacy Evans case. But little interest is now taken in this extraordinary case, and the last act, as far as Sandhurst is concerned, was performed yesterday when a magisterial inquiry was held by Sterry and Losborne, JPs, in the boardroom at the hospital. The identity of Evans with the girl Tremaye was sworn to by Mrs. Holt and Mrs. Rutledge. Mrs. Rutledge had not seen the girl since she left the depot in Melbourne in 1857 until yesterday, but she identified her at once as Ellen Tremaye, and in giving her evidence stated that she was unwell during the whole of the voyage, and Ellen Tremaye occasionally paid her attentions. The patient was visited yesterday by one of our reporters and a lady, and in a reply as to where her children were, she said, "My dear children are in heaven." She appeared very weak, and it was only by fits and starts that a rational reply could be got from her. She seems to be in great dread that she will never get better, and continually muttered, "Oh, I'll die, I'll never get better." During the last 2 days she has taken her food better and appears to be calmer and more reconciled than she was. Mary Rutledge deposed that she was a married woman living at McIver Road, Sandhurst, and arrived in the colony from Plymouth about 23 years ago on the Ocean Monarch. She was then unmarried, and amongst the passengers was a girl called Ellen Tremaye, who landed in Melbourne and went to the depot with the witness. The female passengers used to remark that she was more like a boy than a girl. On the 10th of October 1879, the Bendigo Hospital declined a request by the Kew Asylum to return Evans, as they said he was improving daily and will soon be in a fit state to be discharged. By December, Evans was declared cured and released a few days later, dressed in female clothes. He was released under the condition that he only use his birth name and wear women's clothes for the rest of his life. Should he ignore these, he would be recommitted. Around this time, Julia sued Lorridon for the maintenance of the child. She swore to the courts that her brother-in-law was the father. Evans gave the only corroborative evidence in the case, stating that he had seen them in bed together, but his evidence, given in an incoherent manner, was not accepted, citing that he was still mentally distressed, and the case was dismissed. The scandal and business problems led to the ruin of Lorridon's career in Bendigo, and he left for Queensland, where he was involved in the start of the sugarcane industry. After his hospitalisation, Evans said little about his past and was described as not disposed to be communicative and someone who observes unusual taciturnity. In 1879, when asked why he had impersonated a man, he replied, "Oh, it doesn't matter, and the sooner they put me out of the way and get done with me, the better." The furor of the De Lacy Evans case caused entertainment entrepreneurs to apply to the Bendigo Hospital for permission for him to be publicly exhibited. Samuel Lazar of Sydney offered £3 and £5 per week for a tour. To their credit, the asylum authorities refused the offers. In late December 1879, Evans was part of events by the panorama showman Augustus Baker Pierce, who I've done an episode on, episode 76, and also William Bignell. And these shows were in Geelong and Stawell, and local newspapers contrasted him as strange, unfeminine liking, and said neither mind nor body possesses the vigour once so noticeable. The rival of the other sex in physical and mental ability is now weakly and half-witted. He also appeared in Melbourne at St George's Hall, Bourke Street, in January 1880, billed as the wonderful male impersonator as part of the Living Wonders at the Waxworks. In September 1880 at Sydney's Egyptian Hall, a downmarket music hall in George Street, she shared the billing with a trapeze artist and the Electric Boy at a similar show. And it was about this time in 1880 that the pamphlet, The Man-Woman Mystery, was published, probably to be sold at the shows. There's speculation that in the pamphlet that her husband or paramour was named Edward De Lacy Evans, and then he somehow tricked her by placing his trunk on the Ocean Monarch and deserted her. A man of that name is supposed to have arrived in Melbourne in June 1858 on the ship the Motoka, and was described as a rather handsome young fellow, well developed and with fine flowing whiskers, who worked as a labourer around Ballarat and Bendigo. Evans had acted as a male for nearly 25 years successfully. However, he wasn't a success in show business. By February 1881, Evans had applied in the Melbourne Police Court for admittance to a benevolent asylum, and instead he was sent to the Melbourne Immigrants' Home in St Kilda Road. He remained there until his death 20 years later on the 25th of August 1901. A report in the Weekly Times in 1895 describes him as a sad figure working in the home garden dressed in female garb. Julia Marquand, who for years suffered from a diseased hip, died at the age of 71 in Bendigo in 1913. Julia Mary Evans married Alfred Burton Clay in 1906, and she died in 1945 in the Hospital for Mental Hygiene at Mont Park, where she'd been a patient since 1942. They had a son that died without children in 1960. The story of Ellen Tremaye is an example of the lengths to which some women had to go in order to live as they wished. She gave false statements at her marriages, risked ostracism, and endured exposure to a gaping audience as a show freak. However, dressing and living as a man perhaps gave her a sense of power lacking in her female role. When her secret was discovered, the press and the public could not cope with the affront to society's norms and treated her with voyeuristic curiosity.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.